Hello, welcome to Chapter 10 Race and Ethnicity and Introduction to Sociology. So, let's start off with some definitions. An ethnic group is a social category of people who share a common culture. It is not necessarily based on one's color of their skin. So, popular ethnic groups in the United States include Italians, Germans, Japanese, Arabs, Mexican, Irish, etc. Um, Essentially, if you think of the country of origin nationality, that's a good place to start with. And then ethnic identity is the definition the group has of itself. Identity tends to grow stronger, especially under duress from outside, prejudice or hostility from other groups. So, back in the 1800s, the sign you see on the right hand side, help wanted, no Irish need apply, was very prevalent. The Irish were considered the lowest of the low. And what you see as we look at prejudice from a historical perspective is that there is always one group that is deemed inferior than all the others. And unfortunately, it tends, or fortunately, it tends to transition from one group to the next through the historical timeline. Race is a group treated as distinct in society based on certain characteristics, some of which are biological that have been assigned social importance. So, the important thing to remember with this definition is that there are certain characteristics, and additionally, it has to be assigned by the dominant power. Race is not an exclusive biological construct. So, if you were to go to another country, so for example, Nigeria, you know, everybody is African. However, their tribal affiliation is what divides them and treats them as a distinct group. Racialization is a process whereby some social category, such as social class or nationality, takes on what society perceives to be racial characteristics. Jews are defined by religion. However, Hitler defined Jews as a race. And, consequently, he was able to convince the German population that Jews were in fact inferior and that they should make their best effort to eliminate Jewish people from the face of the earth. Another element that we need to understand is called racial formation. This is the process by which a group comes to be defined as a race. It emphasizes the importance of social institutions in producing and maintaining the meaning of race. So, again, what we want to reflect upon is that it is the dominant culture that determines, the value of race or value of any other characteristic. So, for example, before the Civil War, slaves were counted as 3/5 of a man when it came to representation in Congress. It served the white Americans' purposes, but not the slaves in terms of political power. So the argument, and this was during the era, the late 1700s of George Washington, make slaves count for taxes, but not representation. So the North acknowledged slavery as a way of identifying population in terms of taxing a person, and the South said the opposite, make them count for representation but not taxes. So slaves were seen as valuable in terms of having more representatives, but they didn't want to pay tax on them. And then the infamous 3/5 compromise, where it was decided slaves shall count as 3/5 of a person. And again, today we would look at someone as if they were insane if they said, well, you're Chinese or you're Mexican, so you only count as half a person. Whereas, a couple hundred years ago, this was an acceptable compromise in the country because the dominant power decided it, defined it, made it happen. Another term that we need to reflect upon is minority groups, which is any distinct group in society that shares common characteristics and is forced to occupy a low status in society because of prejudice and discrimination. This group, again, assigned this status by the dominant group. Characteristics include race, ethnicity, sexual preference, age, religion, even gender that is regarded as different from the not dominant group. So, well up until the 1970s and 80s, women were seen as inferior to men because the dominant power dynamic was men. And again, the majorly important aspect of this is that the membership is ascribed or assigned and not achieved. So, members of a minority group feel a strong sense of group solidarity, and this solidarity comes from a shared experience of being discriminated against. So, you'll notice that every year you tend to see in Philadelphia a Puerto Rican Day parade. Neil Patrick Harris, one of the more famous out celebrities, and you do tend to see a lot of gay pride parades through various cities. And again, it's because these groups have been discriminated against, and as such, they have formed a group identity that has allowed them to coalesce and become a political force in this country. We've talked about stereotypes, but just to review, these are categories that are oversimplified beliefs about members of a social group, and they are used to describe the typical characteristics of a group. Every social group ultimately is stereotyped, including the dominant group. We have all kinds of stereotypes about rich old white men, and as a consequence to that, it's a way, power wise, of trying to reclaim some control over the dominant group by the minority or subcultures. Stereotype interchangeability is how certain negative traits are applied to a number of groups. So if you look at how some groups have been identified over the past 250 years, laziness has been assigned or ascribed to African Americans, the Irish, Hispanics, the Italians, and a variety of other groups. And really, what this interchangeability demonstrates is that people tend to categorize others as some giant monolithic group that is defined by one or two characteristics. And this particular map you'll see here on this slide is something that's really, really funny, but it's also very true in terms of how we see the world. We look at Africa, for example, and it's divided into four parts. War, which is the Middle East and North Africa. The empty desert, which is the Sahara area. Oh, and then we have the pirates in Somali, which is our fifth group. Elephants and lions, because we've all seen The Lion King and we know what's out there. And then in South Africa, the racists. And you'll get, again, look at all of these others, and this is the very, very basic perspective of your average American who is not educated about what is going on in the world. And of course, United States, we see freedom, and then there's Texas. And of course, Mexico and South America with our drugs and tacos, and then our jungle savages. Not taking into account there is a whole bunch of Central American countries that are extremely unique in and of themselves. So, prejudice is when a social group is evaluated in a negative way, despite the lack of facts to back up the evaluation. Almost everyone has some prejudice, whether it's about gender, age, race, or sexual orientation. So you get a group of women talking, and they're going to say some prejudicial statements about men. Doesn't mean that they don't like men. It's just that they're going to group men as, again, a giant monolith. Back in the early days of the 1900s, it was common to see signs like this. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. I mean, these are the kinds of signs that would create unbelievable animosity today, but they were fairly normalized in those days because prejudice was much more accepted. So when you hear people talking about the good old days, a lot of times it's because they miss being openly racist. And I know that's a terrible thing to say, but more than a few people have lamented the political correctness of our modern era. Prejudice also is a learned idea. It is not something we're born with. We don't come out of the womb hating a particular group. Attitudes about race are formed early, usually around ages 3 and 4. And there is a clear correlation between a child's prejudice and their parents' opinions. So if you're raised in a household where mom and dad are extremely prejudiced, there's a very good chance that you too will be prejudiced. And then additionally, we also see the media as a major influence on prejudice. We see how a culture is portrayed on television, in the movies or in music. For a long time in the 70s, the only time you saw a black man in a movie was when he was a drug dealer, a thug, or a pimp. Nowadays, the people that we identify as villains in movies tend to be Middle Eastern, and we perceive them because we turn on the news. And where are people getting blown up and bombed? Of course, in these Middle Eastern areas. So we become accustomed to these images, and as such, we develop our prejudices in a very subtle way. Discrimination is the overt negative and unequal treatment of members of a social group. So a lot of these definitions are very similar, but it's important to understand that all of these words reflect a perspective that is usually negative and is usually meant to deem another group as inferior. Racism is the perception and treatment of racial or ethnic groups or members as intellectually, socially, culturally inferior to one's own group. And that's really the key here, is that prejudice, discrimination, racism, all of those things are there to make a person feel better about themselves by making another group feel worse or to declare them inferior. And you'll see a couple comics here about discriminatory suits, which, of course, are really meant in fun, but really do define a serious problem. So let's go over the types of racism. We have the old-fashioned, traditional Jim Crow racism. And these are the activities that we saw in the early 1900s up until the 1950s and 60s with physical assaults and lynchings. We continue to see this today in certain behaviors. For example, in Philadelphia, a group of middle-class white kids beat up a gay couple. And, literally the internet erupted because, it's one thing to have a gay person beat up in Montana or Oklahoma, but Philadelphia is the city of literally brotherly love. So, those kinds of things still go on today, even though they may not be directed towards a specific color in this particular state. Aversive racism is when a person consistently avoids interactions with someone of another race or ethnicity. And this tends to be very common, and again, it's sometimes incidental to where you live. Sometimes it's intentional. But, you have to ask yourself, how many people of another race are you really good friends with? And it doesn't mean that you're a racist. It just means that your circle is pretty small and that you have an opportunity to learn about different kinds of people. Then we have number 3, laissez-faire or symbolic racism. And this is persistent negative stereotyping, especially in the media. Over there on the right, you'll see a picture of a young man named Trayvon Martin, who a couple years ago was killed walking down the street wearing a hoodie and carrying Skittles and an iced tea because he was perceived as being a threatening person. And, basically the country was appalled because you see this kid who, yeah, is he black? Yes. Is he wearing a hoodie? Yes. Does that mean that all black people who wear hoodies are dangerous? Of course not. Does that mean that all people who wear hoodies are dangerous? Of course not. And yet, this idea that a young black man in a hoodie is a thug is completely ascribed by the dominant culture. And the man who shot him got off. And, again, people are just appalled by this. And it does bring to the attention of the entire country when we are making assumptions about people based on stereotypes. So we have a tendency to blame the minority group for the gap in socioeconomic standing, occupational achievement, and educational opportunities. We don't see the institutional racism of relying on certain rules and laws, such as the drug laws that we've talked about in other classes, as being racist. We just say, oh, well, they're fair. Well, we've seen distinct evidence that they're not fair. And you see a resistance to meaningful policy changes that would equalize social conditions. For example, affirmative action. Another type of racism is called colorblind racism. And this is the belief that racism is an illusion and that race problems, especially in America, will go away if race is ignored altogether. That's like ignoring the difference in ages between people or the difference in genders between people. It's part of who we are. And as a consequence, it has to be acknowledged in order for us to understand one another. Number 5, individual racism, which is discrimination because of visible biological characteristics such as black skin or Asian eyes. And again, what we see here is discrimination based on an obvious characteristic that could define or not define somebody. My friend is Asian and her children are half Asian, half white, and they have, other than a passion for Chinese food, no Asian characteristics other than how they look. And, consequently, they're always surprised when someone is discriminatory towards them because they see themselves as white. Then we have number 6, cultural racism, which is when one group claims their cultural heritage is superior to another. The Germans persecuted the Jews because they saw them as an inferior race. The Americans enslaved Africans because they saw them as inferior. The Egyptians enslaved Jews 4,000 years ago because they were defeated in battle and as such were declared inferior. So it's something that humans have a tendency to do no matter what. Institutional racism, which are institutions that manipulate or tolerate policies that unfairly restrict the opportunities of certain groups, races, or cultures. And in the United States, we had segregated schools back in the 1950s and 60s. The doctrine of separate but equal was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court because it was reflected that, in fact, the schools were not equal. They were kept separate because, the inner city ghetto schools were underfunded and the suburban white schools were overfunded to a certain extent. Now we're going to look at why people are prejudiced. So we're going to start off with psychological theories of prejudice. The first one we look at is the scapegoat theory. And this is when members of the dominant group feel certain frustrations in their desire to achieve economic or social success. They vent their anger and aggression towards a minority group who they perceive as undermining their potential for success. So, for example, today, white and black people claim that Mexican immigrants are taking all the jobs, when in fact, most of the Mexican immigrants are coming in to work the fields, which is something that a lot of white and black and Asian and every other group that is already an American citizen doesn't want to do because the labor is absolutely backbreaking difficult. And again, you don't see a lot of Mexican immigrants coming in and being made the chief operating officer or chief executive officer of a company. Then we have what's called the authoritarian theory, which is people who have an authoritarian personality, such as a strict conformity to the rules, intolerant towards ambiguity. They see things in black or white, not in shades of gray. They're very superstitious. They're extremely conservative politically, and they're very religious, have a tendency to rigidly categorize people in oversimplified stereotypes. Now, you yourself might be somebody that I've just described as an authoritarian type person, but you are not a prejudiced or discriminatory person, and that's absolutely accurate. But this is the tendency of these people. This is the average, doesn't mean everyone. One of the worst offenders of this particular group theory are the Westboro Baptist people who just hate just about everybody. And they go to these public events with these horrible signs, and they're pretty much vilified, but their rights are protected under the First Amendment. Now, a few last summer, I think, or a summer before that, one of the gentlemen, and I use that term loosely, from Duck Dynasty was saying all kinds of incendiary, discriminatory information about black people and gay people. And they were punished by being suspended from the show. This is because not that they don't have a right to free speech, absolutely, but the man who said this was during a promotional interview for the show, which meant he was in the service of his job, and his station that the show is shown on has a non-discriminatory policy, so he violated it and he was suspended. Of course, after he was suspended, there was an outcry because people didn't really understand the issue of it being the employer's prerogative. But the Westboro Baptist Church people came out defending the Duck Dynasty people, which is really a little bit awkward because most people in this country find the Westboro Baptist Church people to be pretty horrendous and hateful. Now we're going to move on to the sociological theories of prejudice and racism. And again, we're looking from a functionalist point of view, a conflict theory point of view, and the social interactionists. So let's start with the functionalists, who believe that prejudice occurs when a group does not assimilate into the dominant society's culture, language, art, and customs. So in other words, what they're saying is if you come to the United States as an immigrant, or you were born in this country to immigrant family, and you do not subscribe to the standards of the American perspective, i.e., speaking English, they believe that that is the consequence. Prejudice exists because you have not become a true American. The conflict theorists believe that conflict between the classes is inherent and it's a fundamental part of social interaction. So, what a conflict theorist would say is that, you're never going to get rid of prejudice. You're never going to get rid of the idea of discrimination because people are scrambling for resources. And because they scramble for resources, there is a natural inborn tendency to declare one group inferior to the group that you belong to. Then we have the symbolic interactionist theories, who believe in the contact theory, whereby interaction between the dominant minority groups will improve relations if the following conditions apply. the interaction between the individuals is of equal status and on equal ground. So, for example, if you were to look for a roommate and you found somebody who was perfect for you, but they were of a different race or a different gender or a different age, the idea here is that the more time you spend with somebody and the more time you get to know somebody, the more you realize that there's not that many differences other than the most obvious differences of age, race, gender, and so forth. Additionally, contact must be sustained and not be short term. So, for example, most of us will come into contact with minorities on the job. And, when you work with somebody who's a different race or a different ethnicity, you get to know them. And as a consequence, you see the characteristics that you share much more than the characteristics that differ. The social norms favoring equality must be agreed upon by the participants. So, if you walk in there and you make a lot of discriminatory, prejudicial statements, you're already defying the social norms of equality, and you will be avoided like the plague because you are not, in fact, creating an equal environment. The census data, this is probably earlier in your PowerPoint, but it got out of order, so we've already looked at this. And just to kind of express the population in terms of African Americans or blacks, you see along the East Coast, along the southern route, a preponderance of African Americans. And then you look out into the West Coast and the North, and it is literally a white wasteland. There's hardly any people of color in these states. So in Pennsylvania, we have a much different skewed perspective of race because we're such a diverse culture. And it's important to remember as Americans that there's a whole lot of country where African Americans have a very small representation. So let's look at some specific minority groups in this country that have not always had the easiest time of it, starting with Native Americans. Native Americans live in abject poverty, suffer massive unemployment, and many are alcoholics. They are literally the lowest rung on the socioeconomic ladder with the highest poverty rate. And part of this is because when the white settlers came to the United States, they pretty much moved to wipe out the Indian population and subjugate them. They were moved onto reservations. The housing is substandard. They weren't given many opportunities to stay with their culture. They were not allowed to learn their language. They weren't allowed to study their history. And so as a consequence, a lot of American Indians or Native Americans felt disenfranchised and as a consequence have really given up in many ways. The United States in recent years have made concessions to the behavior of the white settlers, and as a consequence, now you see a lot of Indian reservation casinos. They've been given casino licenses to try and help them come out of poverty, but that's a relatively new program that the U.S. government has applied. Now, in terms of immigrant Americans, groups that come from another country, they tend to have a very similar perspective, no matter if it was 100 years ago or more recently. They all experience these three elements: a system whereby white people create the rules and run the social institutions. They experience economic exploitation and political powerlessness. This is a picture of a cold water flat or a tenement in New York in the early 1900s. A family of 4, 5, 6, 7 would live in a small little room like this. Today you see a lot of Asians, Hispanics coming in who are migrants or immigrants, and they rely on social programs run by churches a lot of times for their daily food. This is a Meals on Wheels kinds of thing that immigrants rely on just to keep their families fed. African Americans are an interesting immigrant group because initially they were brought to the United States as slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation essentially freed them in 1863, but racism is still an ongoing problem in the United States. Ex-slaves who stayed in the South were exploited through the sharecropper system, whereby ex-slaves worked on the white person's land for a share of the crop. And of course, the share that they received was so small that it wasn't enough to keep one in food and housing. This is what a sharecropper's cabin looked like. And again, multiple family members, one room, not much better than the immigrant groups that were up in New York in the tenements. They had a few acres that belonged to somebody else, but they got to keep the food, which then they could then trade or sell for other products. But, they really didn't have very much. Blacks who migrated north ended up being warehoused in ghettos in northern cities. These are the folks that they were turned into trash collectors, street sweepers. They collected the horse poop before the cars. And really, they were given the worst possible jobs. The Jewish population is an interesting one because they are not, in fact, usually on the lower socioeconomic rungs, but they're often vilified for being successful. And part of their culture is the understanding of the value of education as a way of getting ahead. So they're oftentimes really disliked for their success. The U.S. has the largest population of Jews in the world, including more than who live in Israel. So 40% of the world Jewish population lives in the United States. We call hatred of the Jewish race anti-Semitism, and it is still very prevalent in the United States and Europe and the Middle East. The question that a lot of people ask is, why are Jews hated? There is a perception that they control the banking industry, which is not true. There is the old idea that they demanded Jesus' death, which again is not true. They wanted to overthrow the government by destroying the economy. Again, not true. And another reason that they're so hated is because it's believed that they created communism, which again is not true because communism essentially says that there should be no religion. So how a religious group could create a political group is just ironic in some words. So what it all boils down to is this assimilationist perspective. And again, the concept here is if a minority person imitates the dominant white culture, they will be seen as American. And unfortunately, that does not take into account the fact that you cannot hide the color of your skin, the shape of your nose, how your hair appears. So, again, what we perceive is that people who don't act American should not be treated American. But, just by being in this country and being a citizen can, in some ways, define a person as being an American. So it's all about the perception and how people are perceived by the dominant culture. So, other issues that are not taken into account. How much time it takes to assimilate into a culture. It is difficult when you are born and raised in another country to come to the United States and be an American immediately. It takes time. When I came to the United States, I was around 12 years old and I had been living in Europe for most of my life. And I walked into an American grocery store, and instead of 4 or 5 different kinds of cereal, there were 100 kinds of cereal. That was overwhelming. Um, and I know that sounds like a fairly shallow example, but if you come from a place that doesn't have a lot of resources, and then you come to the United States and you see these supermarkets, it's just mind blowing. Also, how a group arrived in America will often change their experience. So, a huge number of Africans were brought to the United States in the 17 and 1800s, unwillingly as slaves. Now, compare that to a group like people from India or China who come to the United States. They work hard, they save their money, they buy a business, then they send for more relatives to come over, and they work their way through the economy by being business owners, entrepreneurs, and they manage to achieve the so called American dream because it was their decision. Everything was their decision. Keep in mind that because whites were the first to arrive, they established the dominant society by eliminating the vast majority of Native Americans. When the immigrant groups came next, the dominant white culture created institutions that made it difficult for other groups to get ahead. And you've seen many signs that have been in this PowerPoint and in other PowerPoints that demonstrated the inadequacies of the government to maintain equality, despite the idea that all of us are created equal. Some immigrant groups have a hard time assimilating because of their assigned or ascribed status, such as the color of their skin. While white people could change their name to blend in, black and brown people cannot change the color of their skin. If you look at some of the great recording artists of the early days of this country in the early 1900s, a lot of them changed their names from very, very Jewish sounding names to very middle of the road neutral sounding names because they did not want to be identified as Jewish. And the reason they did that was because of the discrimination they would have faced in an industry being identified as Jewish. So, a couple other things to reflect upon in this PowerPoint. The assimilation model questions whether it is possible to maintain a cultural pluralism, which is defined as different groups in society maintaining their distinctive cultures while also coexisting peacefully with the dominant culture. So, just in the Philadelphia area, think of Little Italy in South Philly, where you go to the Italian market, or Chinatown in Center City. These are both places that have held on to their cultural heritage without abandoning the American ideal. And what it proves is that, in fact, cultural pluralism is possible, but it has to be embraced. If you think about what we do on various holidays, in my family, on Thanksgiving, we have 2 or 3 different kinds of potatoes because we're Irish and we love potatoes. An Italian family might have ravioli at Thanksgiving. A Polish family might have, the different kinds of little pierogies and stuff at Thanksgiving. So we bring in our cultural heritage to all American holiday like Thanksgiving, because it celebrates not only who we are today, but where we came from. The concept of segregation is the spatial and social separation of racial and ethnic groups. Those who are segregated often live separately under inferior conditions and are given inferior educations, inferior jobs, and inferior protection under the law. Segregation was the rule in the early part of the 1900s in the South. And it came under fire as people said, you cannot treat another human being as inferior, especially after World War II, and we saw what happened to the Jews under Hitler. So by 1964, segregation had been determined to be illegal, and it was, in fact, the move made to desegregate a lot of places. And it's still, you go to certain university campuses and you do not see a black person or a person of color on campus. Um, and part of that is because they keep the tuition really high. They have very high admittance standards in terms of if you are somebody off the street coming in, it is virtually impossible to get in. Whereas if your mom or dad had attended the university, you are called a legacy and you get points just for being a legacy. Um, so there are institutional rules that still exist today that are not necessarily fair, but society doesn't get upset about them because they're not promoted as being discriminatory. Then we have another term called the urban underclass, which are groups of minorities and poor people who live at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in urban areas. These are people who live in abandoned houses, people who are literally so poor that they barely have the money to feed their family and oftentimes don't have enough education to file for food stamps or welfare. So we're going to finish on a topic that is still very controversial in this country called affirmative action. And this is usually a race-specific policy for reducing jobs and educational inequality by recruiting minorities for employment consideration and setting aside a certain number of slots for traditionally underrepresented jobs and educational opportunities. So if you are Hispanic or African American or Native American, you may get certain number of points towards a job or admission into a high-level university because historically there have not been a lot of African Americans, Native Americans, or Hispanic Americans who've been accepted to the university. Two of our Supreme Court justices were able to advance in their careers and in college, university, through affirmative action. Sonia Sotomayor, who is Hispanic, and Clarence Thomas, who is African American. Interestingly, while Sonia Sotomayor will speak frankly about affirmative action and how she benefited, Clarence Thomas refuses and rejects the idea that he, in fact, was able to achieve certain successes in his life because of affirmative action. And yet, the record is pretty clear that he did receive a lot of opportunities because he was a intelligent young black student who qualified for these. And then there's another comic here, which I think is interesting. You have a young black man trying to climb up a cliff, standing on a small box that's identified as affirmative action. And the white man on the top says, "Hey, no cheating," because he was already born at the top. And again, as I mentioned, this is very controversial because if you're a person who did not get into a university or did not get a job because a Hispanic or Native American or a black person got it instead of you, there is a lot of resentment and anger and aggression about that. However, there is also the historical reality that these people have been undermined by the government and by the population of the dominant culture through their historical experiences in the United States. So that's going to finish up this chapter. If you have any questions, please email or text me, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.